Welcome back to Misconceptions. I am very honored and excited to have somebody who I've been watching from afar, I would say, especially in the early years of my career in perinatal mental health. I am honored to welcome Jessica Zucker. Thank you so much for saying yes.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
So, I'd love for you to begin by introducing yourself to my audience. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So, my name is Dr. Jessica Zucker. I'm a Los Angeles-based psychologist specializing in women's reproductive and maternal mental health. And I somehow became known as somebody who works singularly with pregnancy and infant loss. The reason for that is because 16 weeks into my second pregnancy, I had a miscarriage while I was home by myself. I had to, instructed by my OBGYN by phone, I had to cut the umbilical cord. I promptly began to hemorrhage. I then, my husband got home as fast as he could, and we brought the fetus in a bag to my doctor's office. And in order to put an end to the hemorrhaging, I then underwent an unmedicated DNC. All of that to say that this trauma that I had specialized in, I guess you could say at a distance, yes, I had read every textbook that existed. And yes, I had sat with hundreds of women at this point, hearing about the pain, the grief, the anguish, the alienation of pregnancy and infant loss. Suddenly, I knew it. Suddenly, I felt it. Um, and so inevitably, this sort of changed the course of my personal and professional life. I had had a background in public health. So I had a master's in public health, and I had worked internationally in women's rights, women's reproductive health. And so when I decided to pursue my PhD, I was very clear that what I was trying to do is sort of marrying my background in public health with my newfound clinical skills.
What was the intersection for you of the connection between public health and clinical work? What was that intersection like?
Well, to be honest, I always knew that I wanted to be a psychologist. When I read Dr. Carol Gilligan's groundbreaking book, In a Different Voice, when I was about 18 years old, I was dead set on kind of following in her footsteps, or, trying to sort of do something along those lines. And yet, I come from a family of therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. So I had spent a year in Israel on a community service project after graduating from college. I mean, I've been to Israel countless times, probably 10 times at this point. And I, the work that we were doing was very public health oriented. And so that's what inspired this kind of idea of like, okay, maybe I can make a difference in the world in the areas that I'm very passionate about without having to be like the rest of my family members. Um,
So, like, not like sitting in the room with every client, but doing something a little bit bigger, a little bit more global.
exactly. And thinking like, okay, if I can help change systems, if I can help get money to countries that, are underwhelmed financially, like if I can be a part of understanding it from that perspective, that maybe that will feel meaningful and fulfilling. And I did do that. And I was in Nigeria and Senegal and Nepal and India and many other places along the way. But when I wasn't on the road, I was finding myself behind, a computer at a desk alone. And that's just not what I envisioned for my life. Also, when I was starting to consider, like, in my late 20s, what I wanted, what I envisioned in terms of family and a lifestyle, as time went on. I mean, I didn't have a partner at the time that I was envisioning this with, but just thinking about the course of my life, I realized, like, yes, these experiences were life changing. but I also, got malaria and nearly died in Nigeria.
Oh gosh.
So yeah, I mean, and actually, I was there for Rosh Hashanah, but that's a whole other story. And so I ended up spending Rosh Hashanah with all these Jewish people in Nigeria. It was the most profound. They saved my life. I credit them with saving my life
Mm,
because of how sick I was. But I just, yeah, I mean, I knew that I wanted to be, well, I mean, this sounds a little grandiose. I wanted to be sort of a change maker in this space somehow. And it just became clear that uh, I needed to lean into the clinical work because I love this sort of intimacy of the one on one. You
sure.
know, it was exciting and interesting to work on sort of global projects and perspectives. But what I love so much about this work, as I'm sure you do too, learning about the history of somebody, the family dynamics, why you are who you are, why you feel ashamed of this, why you're quiet about this, why you feel proud of that. Like that to me is it just it feels even more sort of alive. And I mean I go back and forth because it's like, well, then I'm only helping this one person who's with me during the day. But through writing books and through my, Instagram account and all these other things, I'm hoping that I'm reaching more people than those who sit with me on a daily basis.
So let's take that avenue. I think again, the way I was introduced to you was actually through probably Facebook many, many years ago. And the thing that I learned from you and actually still have printed out and share with my clients is you have a series of drawings relating to weather, about having a pregnancy after a loss. And I actually use that quite a bit in my teaching. I reference it all the time because I feel like it has such a wonderful visual of what pregnancy after loss is, how it's experienced by people who've had a miscarriage. So, if you could take us back a bit to when you had your own loss, and you just described it to me pretty profoundly, and also I heard in your voice this idea of like I was alone. Like I was by myself. I was in my house alone. I was given a DNC without anesthesia, which by the way is not as uncommon as we'd like to be. And yet, this feeling of aloneness, I think that's kind of to me how I imagine you launching into this perinatal space of teaching and connecting with other women. Tell me a little bit more about how that worked for you from your own personal loss into like I had a miscarriage hashtag. I need hashtag I had a miscarriage
Sure.
into like this is a more of a bigger movement of we need to be talking about these things.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes. So, right. So, I had been specializing in this. I had read all the books. I felt as prepared as possible. And I would sit across from women who had had these losses and I would empathize as much as I possibly could. And as you know, I don't believe that therapists have to have experienced every single thing that our patients talk about because that, isn't really possible um, in order to be useful and helpful to them. But it wasn't until I experienced my loss and understood the feelings they had been expressing for so long that I was like, actually, in this realm, not understanding it corporeally, like not having experienced it viscerally in one's body, going through that, it was distant, right? So people would talk to me about what the research shows that a majority of women are blaming themselves, feeling self hate, like body failure, aspects of excruciating shame, alienation from their communities. And of course, again, I would listen and I would empathize and I would sort of digest what they were telling me. And I could imagine that it would be that way. But it wasn't until I went through it personally that I saw that come alive. So then, not too long after, so my loss was in October 2012. And I think it was October 2014, since October is Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month. So on the 15th, which is like the designated awareness day, that's when I launched the I Had a Miscarriage campaign with my first New York Times piece. And essentially, I had somebody make a sign, a calligraphy sign that said hashtag I had a miscarriage. And I was holding the sign, but I wanted the image to not include my face. I wanted it to be any person could see this and relate if they had gone through this. And in that piece, and again, I didn't think through like, oh, I'm about to get on a soapbox. I'm about to start a campaign. I'm about to eventually write a book. I wasn't honestly formulating something long term. I was more like, I cannot live in a culture that where women are reporting these things on a daily basis. Why? Because as you know, miscarriage is going nowhere. It's not a disease, and it impacts approximately 1 in 4 pregnancies, and stillbirth 100, and I think in 1 in every 160 pregnancies, on and on with the statistics, terminating for medical reasons, infant loss, all of it. So I decided, and it took me some time to really sort of reflect on like, is this an appropriate thing to do? Is this worth the risk? I decided I'm going to use myself and sort of model this as a psychologist, because psychologists, as you know, typically are not spilling the contents of their personal life with their patients, in on social media necessarily.
Wait, so let me ask you, did you really were you concerned that there would be a risk? Like what was was the risk like I'm exposing myself publicly? Did you feel like there was a different kind of risk associated with this kind of campaign or disclosure?
Well, I mean, up until that point, I had never talked about myself in therapy. And even though I was already writing about other topics like body image, whatever, other things related to the areas I specialize in, it was never personal. So this was the first time that I was going to say, here's what happened to me and here's how it happened. And the risk there was not for like people who I would never meet, but my concern was for patients who may come to see me eventually, or people who had seen me in the past and came across. I didn't want to scare people. My story is especially, I think, unusual. A second trimester loss is a lot less common, obviously, and in the context of my home and all of these things. Most of my patients report going to the doctor and there's no heartbeat, and then they schedule the DNC and so forth. So yeah, I just didn't know which way it would go. But I did feel like, you know what, this is an opportunity to be more transparent, which again, I mean, social media has done. I mean, so many therapists are influencers at this point, and they're, walking around in like bathing suits or like, lingerie or
Not
whatever.
sure how I feel about that, but we'll put that to the
Exactly. But you
side.
know what
Yeah.
I mean? It's like, I mean, it probably wasn't as big of a risk as I thought it might be at the time, but it was 2014. So it was a while ago. And I put it out there. And basically my call to action, like my compassionate urging was, if you've had a miscarriage and you haven't talked about it and you feel silenced, stigmatized, or ashamed of this, now's the time. Like together, we can change culture by whispering our story, by getting on a rooftop and shouting our story, writing a piece about our story. Like, I in no way think everybody needs to do what I do. I don't,
Sure.
a lot of people want to be private about a loss. I totally respect all of that. But my central concern is, are we being quiet about it because culture has told us we have to be, or because when we did share with our best friend, we were met with platitudes that were so offensive and off putting that then we went silent, or because our doctor told us, well, don't share your news until you're out of the woods into the second trimester because you don't want to have to tell somebody if you have a miscarriage. So it's like all of these types of things.
So when you think about how things were in 2014 to 2025, one of the things that I think is we're still fighting this idea of shame and stigma. And it's one of those things that I actually feel like there's a lot of people that are kind of, I don't understand why. Why is there shame? Why is there still stigma associated with a miscarriage? I didn't do anything to cause it. Like it wasn't my fault. But what, in your experience, has been the pervasive kind of theme that you hear from people who've experienced a miscarriage when it comes to shame specifically? What is it about a miscarriage that feels shameful?
Yes. So I think of this as a sort of strident trifecta. So the silence leads to the stigma, leads to the shame, leads to the silence, to the stigma, to the shame. I feel like it's this kind of swirling system that needs to be broken. The shame comes from the fact that we don't talk about it. So even yesterday, one of my patients was talking about, but what if that sip of coffee was the reason? What if that workout class was the reason? And so on. I mean, people think out loud with me, like, was it the fact that I had sex even though I was allowed to? Is it the fact that I had an orgasm and I masturbated during pregnancy that, made me lose my pregnant? I mean, so it's all of these thoughts that people have that they don't feel they can be open about, or that people aren't talking enough about, so that they feel then like it's this kind of like odd or abnormal thing to be worried about or to be concerned about. That morphs into the shame.
So what's interesting to me though is that it's interesting that that was the angle that you took, is the shame of what if I had done something to cause this to happen, like those intrusive or maybe even like distorted thoughts about like, could it have been that, or just the thoughts of I hold a responsibility. When I hear shame from my clients, I actually hear it more along the lines of, this is what every other woman does. They get pregnant, they have babies. They get
Yes,
pregnant and they have babies. And my body is failing,
yes,
and
that's
therefore I'm
right.
a failure. And I am so embarrassed about being a failure that that's where the shame rhetoric comes in. I actually heard a quote from a woman who said, actually, it was a group of women together in a support space who said, yeah, I mean, let's be honest, we're baby killers. This was a recurrent loss group. And the way that they spoke about their bodies as being killers of babies, literally, those are the words they use. We are baby killers. My body kills my babies. Think about the layer of intent, right? All of us as therapists were like, ooh, right? And for
Wow.
them, this feels very real.
Yes. Yes, I thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, the idea of body failure. That's another reason I decided to start my campaign, not stop writing on this topic, and eventually wrote my first book, because it's so sad. It's so disturbing. And I mean, obviously as a therapist, we can't just say, of course it's not your fault. I mean, we can say that, but
Right.
like, if this is how they feel on the deepest level, then it's, I think, incumbent upon us to understand their histories with their bodies. Why would this be? So I did not feel my body had failed me. We were able to send the fetus for testing. There was a chromosomal abnormality. So in a way, and again, I get into this in my first book in detail, but and a little bit
What's the
in
name of your first book, by the way? You may as well name
the,
it.
the first book is I Had a Miscarriage, a memoir.
Okay.
And then the second book, which also includes my miscarriage story, this one takes on all the topics
Right.
related to women's milestones and women's lives.
And that's called Normalize It. And I want to get to that shortly, but I definitely want to continue this conversation first. But
Yeah.
we're going to talk about the
Yeah.
book Normalize It shortly. Yeah.
So for me, because I had hardcore answers to why this happened, I actually found not relief, because I still wish it hadn't happened, but I felt acknowledged. I felt a validation. I felt like, okay, my first child was healthy and the pregnancy was uneventful. This was catastrophic, traumatic, and an anomaly, hopefully. And then I sort of, well, I flirted with the idea that I could trust that I could potentially have another healthy pregnancy. I mean, the doctor said there was no reason I couldn't, but of course, we live in ourselves and we have anxiety and fear and trepidation that goes coursing through our veins after a loss and when we're on the precipice of thinking about trying to get pregnant again.
Talk to me a little bit more about this idea, because I know you mentioned that you spoke or wrote about body image as well. And that just like kind of highlighted a thought for me about this relationship to the body. When you're exploring that with your clients and the women that you're, or individuals that you're working with, talk to me a little bit more about the relationship between their historical relationship with their body and now they have a miscarriage, and
Yeah.
how, I mean, it's one of those things that I think is actually so complicated and also not written enough about, like even just pregnancy and eating disorders or pregnancy and body dysmorphia. There are very few books out there, and of those that are there are not exactly particularly comprehensive. And like it's really something that I think is underreported in terms of how women are experiencing their bodies throughout this pregnant and postpartum process. So tell me a little bit about what you're noticing when you're working with someone who you see has this like shame, lights are flashing.
Yeah.
When you begin to explore the relationship with their body, what does that sound like? What are you hearing and what are you asking?
Well, it sounds like an echo chamber because, in a way, there's so much similarity between these women's stories, even if they've had such different backgrounds, come from different cultures, come from such different family dynamics. I think the through line is what culture's been telling us, or what culture tells us not to talk about, which is, and I get into this in Normalize It. And like I said earlier, Dr. Carol Gilligan's work is so focused on adolescence and how this idea that girls know what they know until they're met by culture and they come up against a wall and they start to quote unquote not know what they know. This is the kind of language that she uses, meaning we start to take parts of ourselves underground. We start to show a happy face when we're not feeling happy. We start to say that we're good or we're okay or whatever, even when we're not. And so she found this in her research, in qualitative research. So she sat and she watched these things happen. And she doesn't then extend that into body image per se, but we can all sort of speculate how that trickles in, right? Because then it's periods and the silence around those, and that sort of milestone and transition in girls and women's lives that is yet again silenced, stigmatized, often shamed. And then what about my body? How do I fit in? What do I see projected on TikTok, Instagram, but also billboards, magazine covers? What am I supposed to look like? Right. And what am I supposed to feel like about my body? I should always try harder to be better, thinner, fitter, whatever it is. And especially, I mean, I live in Los Angeles and I work in Los Angeles, so there are additional pressures maybe here that may not be in other parts of the country or the world. But the through line, though, being, why did my body do this to me? Why did my body betray me? Now I look pregnant, but I'm not pregnant. This is
Right.
a cruel joke, you know, and how am I supposed to trust that my body can give me what I want? And so it can reignite, let's say, an eating disorder from the past, as a way to kind of punish oneself,
Mm,
perhaps, or to feel. So pregnancy loss, as you know, underscores, like, reproduction in general shows us just how out of control we
sure.
are in so many other aspects of our lives. If we try hard enough, we've been taught that we can gain access to it, whether it's a particular school, a particular job, whatever it may be. This falls out of that realm. I mean,
Right.
you can, if you have the resources, you can do IVF 100 times, but there's still no guarantee that you're getting a healthy baby. And
I
so,
will say, I have
yeah,
to acknowledge that it's one of the things that I'm hearing a little bit more often. This idea of like, they don't get pregnant right away, they being whoever the person is that I'm in conversation with or about in consultation, perhaps, where they're not getting pregnant right away. And so they're jumping right to treatment. And there's just this sense of like it's got to be done on my timeline, which is fascinating to me because I mean, historically, if you couldn't get a diagnosis within a year, I'm sorry, you couldn't get a diagnosis until you were a year of trying, right? 1 year of trying under the age of 35, you had 1 year to try, and then you can get the diagnosis of infertility if you didn't get pregnant. But now I'm hearing of women and couples who are going to infertility treatment at 6 or 7 months post beginning to try. Like, where did this become our timeline versus like, give the body some space, give the body some time? But this control thing is really showing up quite a bit, which I think also then will interplay in this shame spiral, right? Of right, like if I set my mind to something, I should have it, and then when I have it, I should keep it, and if I keep it, I'll have a healthy baby. And like, what happens when that doesn't play out properly?
well, and then what happens if you do have that healthy baby and then you're unhappy? So I
Sure.
mean,
All right. And then you get into the postpartum. Right.
right. I mean, we could get into
Exactly.
the
Exactly.
perinatal postpartum mood and anxiety disorders. It's like, wait, now I'm finally pregnant. I'm riddled with anxiety. I'm freaking out that this isn't going to happen or that this is,
Right.
right? Some people are blindsided by thoughts of like, what was I thinking? I don't know that I'm ready for this. And the baby's born and they feel no connection. So it's all connected because we are taught, we are sold in movies and elsewhere that motherhood is all about the glow.
Right.
During pregnancy you should be beautiful and glowing and it's all good and you're getting it all together, the room, the all the things.
Right.
And then the baby arrives and you're supposed to fall in love at first sight and feel bonded, and then however you feed the baby, that should work easily, and all of this sets women up to feel that much more ashamed. We're back to
Exactly.
shame.
Right.
When they
Exactly.
don't feel this way, when they
Right.
feel, let's say, ambivalent,
Right.
when milk isn't coming in and that makes them feel X, Y, and Z, or they decide to bottle feed and that makes them feel another type of way because of the pressure to breastfeed these days. I mean, it just
There's
goes,
so much, right? There's so many layers to this,
I
One of the
know.
things one of the things I'm also considering is also the cultural influence, right? So many of the women that listen to my podcast are Jewish women, many of them Orthodox women. And I think about the incredible identification with motherhood from a very, very young age. And I'm not talking about what needs to be changed or what needs to be done differently, but there's such a heavy emphasis on motherhood being the goal. Like the goal is motherhood. And in many ways, I think the way that we're taught and educated at from very young ages, and also what's represented communally and culturally. It's actually something that has come up pretty profoundly when I've had the opportunity to work with people who are navigating a very complex diagnosis of of a young child or a teenager where the child does not have a uterus. And so this is a child who's being raised either MRKH or another kind of diagnosis. And this child is being raised in the community, which highly values motherhood and parenthood, et cetera. This child will, the way that we are going to now teach this child should and needs to be different. But how do you do that in a communal environment where they probably won't know what they're involved in, right? And so it just always gives me this pause of like, what are the messages, the meaning that we're putting into motherhood and these stories that really are actually unfortunately helping us hold some of that shame pervasively throughout quite a number of years and into the future. So
Wow, that's really interesting. I don't have a lot of clinical experience with women who feel that way, but I mean, I do know about that anecdotally. Wow.
yeah.
Because that's a whole other level of shame that if you're not connecting with your baby or you are having multiple babies and not enjoying the process of motherhood, it's like my fear there is that there's not enough space to be able to talk about the truth of one's experience because there's such
Correct.
pressure to just keep making babies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that that's part of this conversation where I get feedback from women who say, I listened to that podcast and I had never heard someone describe it that way. Meaning, I've had individuals on the podcast who've expressed like I didn't really want to have kids, and or I never thought that I never really thought about what it would become, what it would mean for me to become a mother, because I never really was that interested, and then when I did, it was really challenging. And so the most consistent response has been, I've never heard a religious woman speak that way. So to me, that always makes me, I would say, happy, because it's opening up eyes to, it's not always what we've been sold in childhood of what pregnancy and postpartum and losses, or like what pregnancy looks like, especially when we don't talk that much about loss. And now what I will say is I think things are changing. I definitely believe, and especially in the Jewish world, there's a lot more conversation around loss and miscarriage and even mental health in general. I think things are shifting. I would like to hear a little bit more from you about this new book. So you've done the work on the on miscarriage specifically, and then you've expanded into this new book called Normalize It. Tell me a little bit about that line.
Sure. Well, what I want to say though, before I forget, is I think that that is your book to write. The topic of Jewish women, pregnancy, motherhood, that would be a game changer right now.
We'll
If
talk. We'll
if
talk
if
offline.
you're a writer, and if you, because I mean, wow, people need to have real information about this and have that be normalized. Yes. So my first book came out in March 2021, and 2 weeks later, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So that was yet another sort of obvious trauma. And, I had written so much about pregnancy loss, and I felt like that book was sort of not my parting gift to my community, but it was kind of like, I don't know that there's that much more I can say on this. And it had been like 10 years since my loss. So I was sort of ready to expand my lens a little bit. The diagnosis of breast cancer for me kind of obviously brought my mortality into view in such an excruciating way that I had never thought enough about until that point. And so it kind of took me out of the ring. Obviously, I mean, I wasn't going to be posting on Instagram about miscarriage when I just learned that, like, well, in my darkest thoughts, I was like, I'm going to die. Um, so I share this because, let's see, within like 6 months of my diagnosis, I was approached by a mental health company to write the second book. And it felt like such a breath of fresh air. It felt like a gift. It felt like a real opportunity to spread my wings and, talk about additional topics that I'm hugely passionate about. And I thought, this will help me get through what I'm going through. Um, Little did I know that my team and I would sort of make a decision about my reconstructive surgery that was then took me out of life for a year, basically, because it was a 12-hour surgery, then a follow-up surgery, then a follow-up surgery. So 2022 kind of didn't exist for me. Luckily, and finally, the book is finished. Yay. I
It's
mean,
a huge accomplishment. Talk about
I,
giving birth. I feel like
I
that's the
mean,
birth.
I did not think, I mean, there were times when, my husband would be out of town. I'd call him and I'm like, I'm not doing it. I can't do it. Like, it's just, I can't, I mean, because especially since like it does feel on some level like the breast cancer surgeries they do feel in the rear view mirror at this point. They do. However, I'm required to be on tamoxifen, which is a daily medication that's an estrogen blocker. And that impacts my sleep. That can impact my energy. That can impact my mood because we need estrogen. And so that in some ways has been the most confounding part of my cancer experience thus far. Part of me would rather have like 5 more surgeries than be on this medication for the next 5 to 10 years. It's that difficult. So all of that to say, somehow I got through with community, with support, with therapy, of course, um, with outside editors, and I wrote this book. This book is called Normalize It. The subtitle is Upending the Silence, Stigma, and Shame That Shape Women's Lives. And I take on everything from girlhood. And like I mentioned, the Dr. Carol Gilligan stuff is there, and all the topics in between, all the way through menopause. So each chapter is sort of anchored with patient examples. They're not actual patients, they're fictitious, but to illustrate the point. What point? We are finally, I think, I hope, poised to normalize talking about hard things. Period. All of the hard things: menstruation, body changes, perfectionism, eating disorders, you know, um, issues in friendships, in marriages, the complexities of motherhood, mom wine culture, divorce, uh, and then, obviously pregnancy and pregnancy loss are included, as well as terminating for medical reasons, those kinds of issues, and menopause. Why? Because each and every one of these, if you want to call them milestones, I mean, I think that they are. Maybe friendship is not, because that's ongoing, but these are things that we don't talk enough about when we're going through hard times. And so people end up kind of caving into themselves, reporting a sense of isolation, alienation. This is only happening to me. And as you mentioned earlier, it's like, oh, well, that person's pregnant and that person's pregnant and that person's pregnant. And what I say to my patients when they say that, everywhere I go, there's somebody that has a healthy pregnancy. And I say, how do we know what happened to them before?
Right. Did you
How do
talk at all about like either like dealing with women's cancers or sexual dysfunction? I'm just curious if you touched upon either of those things in the book as
That's
well.
interesting. I didn't take on sexual dysfunction. I felt like that was like out of my wheelhouse because it's a little more like medical, but I did bring up breast cancer. I kind of created a patient who shares with me the psychological complexities of the breast cancer diagnosis, especially because it's, well, I have her have a mastectomy, which is what I had. Um, and so it's the loss of your breast. And
Sure.
I mean, we've grown up identifying so much with that as femininity or not, but that's major, right?
Could we explore that just a little bit? Because I so appreciate you having firsthand experience in that conversation and then also coming to it from a women's health therapy psychology perspective. I think that that's one of the most, one of the things I think I'm also a sex therapist, and one of the things that I think is not discussed is that when a woman is no longer able to have her breasts and what that impact is on perhaps the sexual experience or of like the identity of being a sexual being, right? So even if the breasts are no longer being used for breastfeeding, right? Maybe they've hopefully completed their desire to breastfeed, but that still maintains a certain piece of kind of who they are. And without that, and is anybody, I'm curious if anybody ever talked to you about that. Like, did you ever have like a psychosocial team meeting about like, we want to talk to you about like right? No, the answer
Oh,
is no. Right.
no.
Right.
So I've written a number of articles on all the things that you just mentioned, and I interviewed a bunch of people about sex after loss and how has it changed. A lot of people were talking about the impact of these kinds of medications that you have to be on afterward that really change their sex drive, or people who went, through chemotherapy. But it is also the physical change.
Right.
Do I feel comfortable, being naked in front of my partner? Do I feel comfortable even being alone in the mirror after something like this?
Right.
How do I come to terms with liking or loving or accepting my body? Or can I?
Right.
And I do bring up in the book like this whole like pressure, like the sort of body positivity in quotes movement, this like love your body no matter what. And it's like, well, I think sometimes that goes a little overboard because there are so many dynamics there that we need to unpack. And it's so complicated. And so the pressure to be like, no, 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 I really like that I don't have my original boobs and I don't have nipples anymore. And I, gained weight from this and that. It's like, no, like that is a whole long process to be able to integrate if that even can happen.
Right.
Right.
And doesn't that bring us right back to this this idea of shame, of where we
Yeah.
often, that's where shame shows up. So you say it's not your fault and you couldn't have done anything to prevent it. You had to have the surgery. And yet there can be this embarrassment, discomfort,
Sure.
unable to, to really fully claim our bodies anymore in that space.
Yeah, I mean, we don't see it. I mean, one
Sure.
thing that I said in one of the articles was like, there was that whole movement for a while, maybe it still exists, like free the nipple.
Yes.
Yeah,
Hmm.
okay. So in my piece, I wrote like, can we perhaps free the nipple list? Because
Right. Right.
the reason why, like on Instagram and social media in general, they sort of white out or whatever the nipple. Well,
That's
then
right.
so can people that don't have nipples just kind of show that? And is that offensive? And since we don't see women in Victoria's Secrets ads or whatever lingerie you buy, we don't see anybody without nipples. They're the only lingerie companies where we see that. They're not beautiful and
Right.
they
Right.
are made just for breast cancer. And so
That's
it's
right.
puts you in
Right.
this camp of like, well, you're no longer beautiful, you're no longer going to feel young or vibrant or whatever, no longer the previous version of yourself. But we made these for you. And
Yeah. By the way, I want to mention I actually have a distant family member who runs an organization out of Canada, and I believe it's called Empower Inc. Empower Her or Empower Inc. I can't remember exactly. And they do tattooing. They like fund tattoos for women. Beautiful, beautiful ornate tattoos of the breast and the chest for women who are cancer survivors. And their Facebook page and Instagram page is full of beautiful images and photos and videos of women
Mhm.
who are nippleless, as you just said,
Yes.
and also beautiful and claiming a certain, strength within themselves. And this might feel very foreign to some of my listeners, right? But that idea of like how for some people claiming having a tattoo that makes them feel beautiful helps them claim a certain femininity that they may feel has been lost. What I actually find really interesting, just put it out there, is that I know that there are some rabbinic authorities that will actually permit the tattooing of the nipple onto the breast tissue on the after a mastectomy to help a woman, if that's what's going to help her look and feel like herself, then that there are those rabbis who will permit that. So the things that you never thought, like usually, oh, tattooing is not permitted, right? Well, under certain circumstances, it might be. And it's just such an interesting recognition of the power of self acceptance and of kind of body image of how we feel about ourselves. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, and even for people who didn't overly identify with their breasts, like it's still a loss of something that you've known forever. So
Yeah.
even if you're just like, oh, who cares? Like, I'll just go flat. It's still, you do still have to look in the mirror at what has changed. And I think
Yeah.
that this is us coming full circle on our
Sure.
conversation. It's like, it's the silence, the stigma, and the shame that keep us quiet about these very difficult milestones or traumas that happen in people's lives and leave us feeling anxious, depressed, quiet. And I think we're ready to be done with all of that. I really
Yeah.
do.
I love that we're moving in that direction because I believe even just the podcast, right? We're doing something that's different than was done before. I would love to finish off our conversation today with asking you, what are some misconceptions that you would like to dispel? What are some of the myths or misconceptions that you have about that people have about pregnancy loss that you would like people to know better?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, if I haven't said it already, I think like you did nothing wrong. You did nothing to deserve this loss. And so I understand the hunt, and this sort of intrusive thoughts around like, but what if, that cycle that goes round and round, what ifing. The science shows us that a majority of losses are chromosomal abnormalities or something maybe going wrong, going on in the woman's body. Um, so that's one, so it's like, I just so want people to be able to, I sometimes think people are blaming themselves as not a shortcut, but like as a conduit, like as a way around the grief, the enormity of the grief. So if I did something wrong, I can change it in the future and therefore it won't happen again. It's a desire for that control. We may not have it.
Right.
And it may not be something that you did or didn't do, and therefore grieve. Like it's like, because I think when we're so wrapped up in trying to figure it out, there
Yeah,
isn't that space to actually feel.
absolutely.
And then I guess just, I mean, I don't know if it's a misconception, but I think a misconception, if you want to call it that, like about supporting somebody who's been through it, the platitudes, well, whether it's pregnancy loss, even cancer, all the things, I think we need to lean more into being there. How are you doing? Checking in with people consistently, showing up for them, not saying something like, well, actually, I don't want to offend you. So maybe this isn't something that, maybe this is something you feel comfortable with. I'm not very comfortable with God has a plan. God doesn't
No,
give you more than you can handle. At least you're young. At least you know you can get pregnant. These kinds of assurances, or, oh, you have a healthy child already. Of course, you'll have another one. I think the unfortunate piece of these platitudes is it actually further shuts people down.
I think it creates a distance. I think it just pushes people away. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's
Hmm.
like they're also trying to act as an authority. Like you're not a doctor, you're not God. Like you don't know what's going
Correct.
to be for somebody. So kind of promising something, just, yeah, it feels like a way to not get close to the pain with that
Yes,
person. And so
absolutely.
I think we need to instead huddle around and support in a very sort of, psychologically intimate and compassionate way instead.
Absolutely. I will actually just affirm what you said in terms of even in a religious world and in a religious community and culture. I do not believe it is helpful for somebody to say Hashem has a plan, God has a plan, everything is done for the good. A person can reach that on their own, in their own time and in their own choices. And I will tell you that some do and some don't. And
Right.
we need to create space for all of that, but it's not mine to impose on the person who's going through something difficult. And I think we're so much better off saying things like, I'm just so sorry that you're going through such a hard time. And I'm going to check in on you again tomorrow and then check in on them again tomorrow. And be prepared for them to say, how are you? And they say to you, I'm terrible. Thanks for asking. One of my best podcast choices, is Nora McInerney's. That will be the day that I will be like catching my breath if I get to ever interview her, right? That idea of like, she has the best, most depressing podcast out there, right? And her podcast is called Terrible Thanks for Asking, about like that be prepared that that might be the answer and that
Yeah,
we can handle it and we could say, I'm so glad you told me. Yeah,
exactly. I love that.
exactly. This has been a wonderful conversation. I look forward to reading your book, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us, and especially enhancing my curriculum when I teach about pregnancy loss and pregnancy after losses. I love using those images. It resonates with my students and with the professionals that I have the opportunity to teach. So you're making an impact more than you even probably realized.
Wonderful.
Um,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank
That
you
means
so
so
very,
much.
very much.
I'm so happy to connect with you. Thank you
Thank you
for
for being here.